I want to take a second just to thank the staff for inviting me to preach this weekend. It's been about 6.5 years since I've been out of the pastoral ministry preaching every week, so it took a little bit to get the rust and cobwebs off, and I appreciate the opportunity this morning. Thank you. Well, throughout the past several weeks, this sermon series we've been on, we've heard the stories of several people, often some of the most unlikely, who exhibited a life of faith and elements of a Christ-patterned life. All of these stories are inspiring and reminders that if God can change and work even through some of those folks, then God can surely use you and me. But it's hard. How do we stay focused? How do we stay grounded? With the messaging and divisions and everyday demands bombarding us, how can we possibly live up to those lofty goals that Anne just read in Paul's letter to the Romans? Did you hear what he was asking them to do and be? Do not repay anyone for evil, but take thought for what is noble in the sight of all. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, live peaceably with all. Overcome evil with good. It's quite a list. And here's the spoiler alert. I think Paul knew we couldn't do it by ourselves, and they couldn't do it by themselves, and so did Jesus. I've shared this story with a few of you, but I think it speaks to and is key to how we can make some progress in our goal of living a Christ-patterned life. Late last winter, one of the boys on my son's baseball team made the decision to be baptized, and so his family invited our whole team and all the families to come and to support him and be part of that day. Now, our families have been together for more than 4 years, have spent countless hours together on the road at practice, and have become like a second family. Unfortunately, on the day of his baptism, I needed to be here to teach confirmation and for a meeting, so Casey and Caleb went without me. Well, later that afternoon, when I saw Caleb, I asked him to tell me about the service, what he thought of the experience. He told me he was really glad that he went, and it meant a lot to his friend that he was there, but he also said that it was a little surprising, and he walked away a little bit disappointed. And I asked him what he meant and to explain why, and he said, well, first the pool where he was baptized was really far away from the congregation, and they did the whole thing even before the service started. It was kind of like the pregame show or the opening act to the worship service. And for the baptism, during the baptism, the pastor asked his friend to make his statement of accepting Jesus. He dunked him in the water, and then it was over. He said not only was our team not able to make promises to him, but his congregation didn't make any promises to him, to support him and to teach him and to nurture him as he grew up. It seemed to be just this private thing between him and God. And when it was over, he walked backstage and then eventually made his way to his seat. But there was no singing and walking him through the congregation, making introductions and welcoming him into the community. Wow. We may not always realize it, but our kids are paying attention. And here's a reality check. They take us seriously at our word and expect us to hold up our end of the promises that we regularly make. They understand that there is and should be something very different and special about being part of a church family and being part of this community. Some of you may know that I work in the area of evangelism, and in July I began a new appointment with the Foundation for Evangelism based out of Lake Junaluska, North Carolina. They didn't require us to move, so thankfully we were able to stay in the Nashville area. For the past 6 years, I'd worked as director of evangelism at the General Board of Discipleship. And I'll confess that I did not leave the local church, and I did not take that position from the result of a lifetime love and passion for evangelism. In reality, most of what I had experienced that was labeled as evangelism, which means good news, didn't actually contain much goodness. For the most part, it was some pretty bad news with an escape clause. However, when I went back to school about 10 years ago to get some tools and more skills for my congregation, I began to really learn more about Jesus's and John Wesley's approach to evangelism. And I fell in love with how big and how compelling and how all-encompassing the gospel message really is. So the scripture that I chose for today from Romans illustrates the transformative impact following Jesus should make. It's not just about agreeing to some theological statements or completing a one-time event. It's embarking on a life-transforming, reorienting journey that we're on until we take our very last breath. Now, as someone who works in the evangelism world, I encounter a lot of folks who kind of bristle when they hear the word. So I actually collect what I call evangelism swag, like really bad evangelism. Here's an EvangeCube. Here's the $1 million question if you want to check them out. You can after the service. As a way of kind of debunking where people are coming from when they hear that word. I happily accept whatever tract or stuff they're handing out at sporting events or on street corners, and unfortunately, even at some of the conferences I attend. And Paul's letter to the Romans often provides much of the framework for these materials. And if you just agree with these statements and pray this prayer, congratulations, you're a Christian. Okay, well, now what? So what? What Jesus taught, modeled, and accomplished through his life, death, and resurrection, and what Paul is trying to convey to the churches through his letters, is so much more. What is this good news that we're called to not only accept, but embody, if we are the body? Now, the notion of gospel wasn't originated by Christians or even biblical authors. In fact, this term was commonly used by Romans as propaganda to announce the good news of Caesar's victory following one of his conquests. For those who'd been conquered and were now occupied, this gospel was anything but good. The biblical pronouncement of the good news of Jesus Christ then draws a stark contrast between the two kingdoms, the two empires, and the two lords. So Paul's letter to the Romans isn't a simple individualistic pathway to heaven or even a theological textbook like some folks try to turn it into. It's a letter to a people who seem to be aligning themselves and mimicking the character and values of the Roman Empire instead of living as a community that recognizes Jesus' lordship and embodies his teaching through lives of love and justice. Yes, they identified themselves as and want to be followers of Jesus, but it's really hard. And there are so many other competing voices. And this Roman story, based on power and winning and fear, if you look around, it seems to be working. Isn't it amazing how the realities and concerns facing the church 2,000 years ago still ring true for us today? Paul's words are hard for us to hear and even harder for us to embody. Our world tries to help us see and hold on to the things that divide and separate us, and making that living peaceably with all things is quite a challenge. We want to be we, but those voices keep pushing for a narrative of me or us versus them. We see this tension running rampant in the 24-hour news cycle, political discourse, social media, and unfortunately, sometimes the church. Which side are you on? Are you with us? Are you for us? Who is right? Because somebody has to be right. And that also means that somebody has to be wrong. Where did this come from? This idea that for me to be right, you have to be wrong? This idea that there are two sides and we have to choose one or the other. Why is living as we so hard? I did a little bit of research to unpack this phenomenon a little bit. And as social beings that need connection, it is natural for us to form groups. It's when we find our worth, our value, and our identity in those groups that we run into trouble. Robert Sapolsky, a neurology and biology professor at Stanford, describes how the nature of us versus them is so divisive. People naturally view those who comprise us to be more correct, wise, moral, and worthy. And we have a natural obligation towards others in our group. We readily forgive others like us and have situational explanations to explain away why they did something wrong. On the other hand, when a them does something wrong, it's a reflection of who they are, who they've been, and who they always will be. While it doesn't make it right after reading this, it became a little easier for me to understand how some of the current rhetoric and division continues, despite the latest revelations or even facts that are presented. And as we all have felt, it takes a toll. Brene Brown writes in her book, Braving the Wilderness, "The world feels high lonesome and heartbroken to me right now. We've sorted ourselves into factions based on our politics and ideology. We've turned away from one another and toward blame and rage. We're lonely and untethered and scared. So scared. But rather than coming together and sharing our experiences through song and story, we're screaming at each other from further and further away. Rather than pitching wild and new ideas that could potentially change everything, we're staying quiet and small in our bunkers and loud in our echo chambers." Throughout our lives, all of us wear several different hats and play many different roles. And that helps us to inform our identity. I brought some examples of some of the roles and identities and hats that I've worn throughout my life. First of all, I was raised as the only child of a Marine who was also a Naval Academy grad. You can imagine a little bit of my childhood. As I got older, I found my identity as being a student. And so here are a few guys from some of my schools where I have degrees. And after that, I became a wife. And when we got married, my husband was in the Coast Guard, so I became a military wife and everything that comes with that. Professionally, I was a pastor for 12 years. And so wearing this robe and stole was an everyday or every week thing for me. And then part of my identity was working at the General Board of Discipleship and now at the Foundation for Evangelism. I also serve as a teacher. In a semester every year, I adjunct at one of our United Methodist seminaries. Beginning next month, I'll resume my role of basketball coach. And my biggest role is mom, which this weekend I've especially been a Boy Scout mom, and this afternoon I'll be a baseball mom. So, as I thought about all of my different roles and identities and the ones that all of us have, how do we remember that all of these different hats and roles and things that we wear, none of these are the things that truly define us or give us our value and our worth? It's so easy for us to allow one of these other hats, other than the fact that we're a child of God, to define us. And it's not surprising. When you meet someone new for the first time, what are the first questions we ask of them or that are asked of us? They're questions about our jobs and our families and our education and our social location. And much of our time and our social interactions are spent with people wearing some of our same hats. I already shared with you some of the hats that I wear, and I realize that many of these, for me and for all of us, had a season. They were temporary. A lot of my communities have either disappeared or become less connected as we've moved on and transitioned in life. And we can find ourselves on the outside and no longer part of the we or the us when those life changes happen. Friends, it's into this reality that Jesus' good news, not Caesar's, has the power. The Roman Empire used violence and fear to maintain their power, and they continued being able to divide people, and they counted on people returning violence with violence so they could justify their continued oppression. But through his suffering love on the cross, Jesus said, "No more." This is where the cycle ends. You no longer need to operate out of fear because love wins. It isn't us and them, it's we. Most of the congregations that I have served have the same tradition that this one does of singing Child of Blessing, Child of Promise as a baptismal response. The final verse of that hymn states, "Child of God, your loving parent, learn to know whose child you are. Grow to laugh and sing in worship, trust and love God more than all." We sing those words not as some commission of good luck with this following Jesus thing for the rest of your life, but rather we welcome you to this family where we're all still growing, a community that reminds us of whose child we are. Friends, while we live in a world that seems so connected, people are experiencing record highs of loneliness and isolation. In his letter to the Romans, Paul was trying to welcome people into an alternative story and create a home where people are free to be who God created them to be. This is my prayer for Christ United Methodist Church, and I know this has been what many of you have experienced over the years here, through the ups and downs, through life's highs and lows. May we continue to be a place where people don't question if they belong when all of these other hats or identities fade away. A place where people can leave their fears at the door, where it's okay to doubt, and where people are willing to wrestle and be stretched beyond the echo chamber so prevalent in our society. And all of this is possible because this is where we are reminded of who we are in God's great love and have experienced it in tangible ways. It is then that we're able to live lives of obedience, courage, compassion, and generosity. The world is hungry, and this isn't just so-so news to share. It's the best news, the greatest news. Welcome them home. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.